Well, among Dr. Irina Scott's achievements include serving at the Battelle Memorial Institute. She's also worked for the Defence Intelligence Agency and the Aerospace Centre in satellite photography. She's got probably too many achievements to mention in this introduction, but she's written several books, and it's her last two that are capturing the imagination of the UFO-believing public, Beyond Pascagoula, which was recently released, and the book she co-authored with Philip Mantle, The Pascagoula Close Encounter, Witnesses on the Record. And Dr. Irina Scott is joining us now. Hi, Irina, how are you?
Hello, how are you? And great to be here. Thank you.
Great to have you back too. We spoke a couple of years ago in an interview, and it was very well received. But this time we're talking about one of the, if not the most profound alien abduction story we've seen in this country. And that includes, Travis Walton, amongst others, and of course, the Betty and Barney Hill. But this one has just been getting a lot of press lately. So I just wanted to set the scene, because we're going to talk about some of the new evidence you've uncovered, but briefly set the scene and talk about what actually happened at Pascagoula in 1973 on October the 11th, just so those who haven't heard about it actually know what we're talking about.
Well, this is getting to be, and probably is by now, the best documented abduction report ever. It was two shipyard workers, Calvin Parker and Charlie Hickson. Charlie was about 45 years old, and Calvin was either 18 or 19. And they had finished they were family friends. He was, the young one was a friend of, his father was a friend of the older one, that sort of thing. And so they were just regular people. They weren't UFO people or anything like that. And they decided to go fishing after work. They went several places and they weren't catching anything. And so Charlie, the older one, wanted to go to this place where he thinks he could catch pretty good fish. And it was kind of marked no fishing or something like that, or no trespassing or something. And it made Calvin nervous because it was his car. And so anyway, the older man prevailed and they went out fishing. And then they saw a blue light. And at first they thought it was the police after him, and Calvin was going to say, well, put Charlie in jail. It was his idea, and don't do anything to me. But it turned out to be much, much, much worse than police, because it was a UFO, unidentified flying object. And the thing came fairly close to their dock. And it was kind of hovering above the ground. And it opened up, and there was this real bright light. And then three things came out that looked like beings in a way. They sort of thought they were mechanical though, and grabbed them. And obviously they were terrified and they would fight back, but it was like they had a shot or something, and suddenly they couldn't move. And these two of them had Charlie and one of them had Calvin, and took him aboard and did some scanning, things like that, or anyway, did something that gave the impression they were being scanned, and released them. Well, they were terrified. They didn't know, whether they were captured or would be put in zoos or killed or eaten or what, or whether they'd ever get back. And, they also wondered if this was something the government was doing. And so then they were released after a while, and they were both just absolutely shaken to their souls. And I guess Calvin, after he was released, he was just standing there with his arms up in the air. Mm-hmm. And Charlie tried to wake him up, and I guess maybe they both fell down or something. And then afterwards, they were just like, people that had been captured, they were terrified. Mm-hmm. And at first they said, let's not tell anybody about it. And then Charlie, who was older, he had been in the war and things, and he'd been in life and death situations, and he thought he could handle it. But Calvin was a lot younger, and Calvin didn't want to tell anybody, anywhere, anything. But Charlie said, we should report that. And so he called, first of all, a newspaper, and the newspaper was closed. And then he called the Air Force Base, Kessler Air Force Base. And they said they don't take UFO reports. And so then he called the police, and you can imagine the situation he'd be in.
Yeah.
He said, "You'll never believe this, but we were abducted by a UFO." And they probably wouldn't believe him, except that the person heard Calvin in the background crying and begging him not to report it and everything else. And so they kind of believed him and took him to the sheriff's department. And they separated them and interviewed them and then put them together. And then the person that was interviewing left the room. And what they didn't know was that there was a tape recorder in there. And the sheriff's department thought they had the tape recorder in there because they thought they, if they were hoaxing, well, they would be laughing about how they put one over on them and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they took the tape recorder out, and the two men were just absolutely terrified. And Calvin was saying, "I think I died," and things like that, and praying and things. And so after that, they had a lot more credibility. And then it made the police department had publicized it some, and it made the news all over the world. And they had a credibility because of the tape recording, and everybody talked to him. Calvin told Charlie to tell everybody he fainted because he didn't want to talk about it, and he didn't talk about it for about 50 years.
Yeah. Yeah. The 24 to 48 hours after it happened, I mean, it was a real frenzy, as you mentioned. It made worldwide headlines, but that tape recorder was important. And I think also the other thing that was important was the sheriff letting the two guys know that he actually believed their story.
Yeah, the sheriff believed them. And then other people, they were very credible, and people believed them. They didn't, there wasn't a trace of a hoax whatsoever, and they were both just really shaken up.
So then things kind of calmed down a little bit afterwards, but Calvin moved to Pascagoula initially to enjoy a quiet life, so he didn't really want the spotlight. He was a pretty shy sort of a young guy. And that's probably the reason why it took him 50 years to come out and talk about this.
Yeah, he just wanted to live a normal life, like, having kids and grandchildren and being married and everything. He didn't want to be, a weird UFO freak or anything like that.
Yeah. I've always considered the Pascagoula incident like the first leg of the big 1970s trifecta of abductions: Pascagoula, then Travis Walton, and then the Devil's Den incident in 1977. But this one just continues to get traction, and that's probably thanks to the research done by yourself and, of course, Philip Mantle. What's really fascinated you about this particular case?
Well, what fascinated me is that why I'm in it is, for one thing, there were a lot of sightings the same time as the abduction. But after the two people got harassed so much, people wouldn't talk about it. But now people are coming forth and saying, yeah, some of the other witnesses. And so I've interviewed a number of witnesses, and that's one reason for writing the book. The other reason was that something happened to my family the same time. And I had been investigating something else about that flap years ago. It was actually the same time. And I was at the University of Missouri working on my PhD, and my mother was in Ohio, and there's about 600 miles difference.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother called me one night and said, "Did you hear that noise?" And I joked with her and told her she was going crazy, and she always was worried about, dementia and everything. So I, teased her and told her to get the straitjacket and everything. She was a skeptic, and so I wondered why on earth she would do that. And several days later, she called, and said there was this huge flap going on, and that people were staying in, keeping their kids in, and not going out at night. And one of her friends was chased by a UFO, and all kinds of things were going on. She was in Ohio. And this was the same time, though, as what happened at Pascagoula.
Right.
And so anyway, years later, I was working at Ohio State, and I decided to, just on a whim, to look up, see if I could find when that noise was heard. And Ohio State at that time had a library with all these newspapers. And so I walked into the newspaper room. I didn't remember when it was or anything. And there were zillions of papers, and I thought, I'll never find this. But I decided to look, and I thought it was around the middle of October in '73. And so I pulled out a few papers, and I actually found a report on noise. And so I had a date, and it had never been explained. And so for some reason, I was just interested, mainly because it was such a crazy thing for my mother to do. And I wasn't in UFOs at all at that time. And I started collecting information on it, and nobody had ever explained it. It was a huge noise heard right across the United States.
Like a boom.
Sort of like, yeah. And so anyway, I decided to submit something to a scientific journal, and the state of Ohio seismologist heard about it, and he was quite interested. And he'd worked on some unusual sounds too, and helped me get contact seismograph stations and things like that. And eventually I did publish something in the peer-reviewed scientific literature on it. Well, later there were UFO people in Ohio, and they heard about it and asked me to give a talk. And I called it the Big Bang, and gave a talk about it. Well, that's what drew me into ufology. And what was interesting was the sound was heard just about exactly the same time as the Pascagoula abduction.
Right. I mean, would you say it was connected with the UFO that was involved in that abduction?
I don't know, because the abduction was in Pascagoula, which is down at, the Gulf and everything. And the sound was heard across Iowa and Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and that area. So the sound wasn't where the Pascagoula abduction, but there was a lot going on all over the country then. There was sort of like a flap in Ohio at the same time and things.
Yep. So, Irina, how much extra to the original story have you uncovered?
Well, I've interviewed a lot of people down in Pascagoula, and the sheriff's department at that time, October the 11th, '73, had said that on that date there were like 50 formal reports of UFOs, and then there were a lot other ones that they didn't really keep track of. So there were a huge number of reports of something strange in the sky, but people didn't want to stick their necks out and say anything back then. And now I've interviewed a number of people, including people that were there, that appeared to be there during the abduction and things like that. I mean, close and saw things.
Right.
And so I have a number of witnesses for that. And then for odd things that happened around Pascagoula during the flap. And I also have a lot of information about other events that happened all over the country, including Ohio. And during that flap, and it was a huge flap. It might have been the largest one ever. And so I call it Beyond Pascagoula because it covers a little bit about the abduction, but it covers about all these other witnesses and everything else that was going on at the same time.
Yeah. Did anyone actually report that they actually saw what happened to Calvin and Charles?
Well, Calvin had given a talk at the Pascagoula Library, and it was on YouTube. And somebody had written in and said, my parents saw this. Well, Philip Mantle got a hold of him and asked me to interview him. And so I did. And it turned out that the couple I interviewed were on the other side of the Pascagoula that same night and saw things and had things happen to him.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to the husband, first of all, and he was a skeptic and a debunker, but he said something about a big splash and something about a blimp. And then he handed the phone over to his wife real fast. And his wife said that they were by a pier. A ship was there, and he was going out on the ship with his supervisor to do whatever work they did. But the supervisor was late. And so they were sitting there in their car waiting for the supervisor to show up. The man went to sleep, and the woman was watching, and she said there was this thing that was flying around the river. And she said it was like the pilot was confused. I mean, like an airplane usually goes someplace.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to be just going back and forth and around and all over around the river. And this was, the same time Calvin and Charles were abducted. Well, she said that she just wondered what on earth was going on with that airplane, which she thought it was an airplane. So he decided to take his clothes down and put it in the ship. And he was walking ahead of her on the pier, and she was falling down. And she said this man came out of the water. And she seemed really emotional about this. This man came out of the water right where she was on the pier and came back and went back under, but he never came back for air or anything. And and apparently they walked down about 9 o'clock. Then she came back about 12, which seemed funny to me.
Mm-hmm.
And said she was really, really, really scared and ran down the pier to her car and got out of there. Well, she seemed very emotional about this thing that came out of the water. And I asked her, is it a fish? And she said, no, dolphin. She said it looked like a person, but she couldn't understand it because he went underwater and he stayed underwater and nobody came back up or anything. And she was very emotional. I interviewed her several times. And then later, her husband became very ill. And unfortunately, he died not too long after that. But he had been a skeptic, and he'd always told her not to talk about it, that this didn't happen, that there was nothing going on. And right before they put him on a ventilator, and before that, he told her that they had been abducted themselves.
Wow.
And that he remembered the beings, and he remembered being taken on board, and that they were grabbed and put on board. He remembered examinations, and then he remembered these beings swimming out away from him through the water, and then this thing flew away. Well, that was about the same time as Calvin and Charles had been abducted. And so it's possible, somebody might have seen their abduction in a way, but also it's possible that the object that she was watching might have been the same one that abducted Calvin and
Mm-hmm.
Charlie. And so it might have been a double abduction of two different groups of people, which would be a very first in ufology.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, the aliens described by Calvin and Charles, they're not like your typical descriptions of an alien. They almost look robot-like. Did you come across anyone else who had seen this type of alien before?
I think there was some reports there from a kid that reported, but in general, people reported the aliens as being sort of slender and big-headed and big-eyed and everything like that. But what they reported was sort of porky or, really wrinkled and sort of portly aliens. And I don't think they could see their eyes and things. And they just about as opposite as you could look to what the general opinion
Mm-hmm.
of aliens.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, at the center of the abduction on the ship, of course, was the female that we've reported on in the last few months. But there was one witness. I think she was 12 years old at the time that she pretty much saw the UFO, but she stayed quiet because of a strong Baptist upbringing. I mean, is that the type of witnesses that were in the area where it kind of messed with their religious beliefs?
Yeah, I think it messed with their religious beliefs, and it also messed with, they got harassed badly, and they saw these two people getting harassed, and they decided not to talk about it. But a lot of people would have known when it happened because of being able to date it, because a number of people saw things at night, and then the next day, the abduction came out in the paper. And so they would know when their sighting was. But I talked to a number of people that said they just didn't want to say anything about it because they would get harassed. And now the atmosphere is a little bit different because UFOs have been reported in, seriously, in the New York Times and 60 Minutes and the government report. And they can say, well, it's more official now. They're not crazy.
Mm-hmm. What about Calvin himself following the incident? Did he talk about being harassed as well?
No, I didn't. Yeah, I don't know if he did or not, but I talked to a number of people that told about how they were harassed.
Yeah, because it was a pretty touchy time too, because I mean, it was maybe 10 or 12 years after the Betty Barney Hill abduction, and of course, people still really hadn't accepted that abductions could be real. But when people had the courage to come forward, they would be harassed.
Well, you can imagine shipyard workers too.
Yeah.
It wasn't pleasant at all.
Yeah.
And, people said that they harassed them by telling them they were drunk and all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Irina, there was an incident almost a month after that on November 6th about involving people on fishing boats and a bright light in the water. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there were 16 witnesses, and one of them's alive, and I interviewed him. It was what they called a USO, underwater unidentified submarine object. This was taken totally serious and investigated seriously by the Navy. These fishermen were out and saw this object underwater. They didn't know what it was. And first of all, the person I talked to was 16 at the time. He said his father had this big long oar and was, hitting it and trying to see what it was. And I guess it sounded metallic. Well, then the twin of his father also was out fishing on a boat, and there was another group of people, and they came and looked at the thing, and it was floating around. If they hit it or bothered it, it would turn its lights off. Sometimes it would turn its lights on real bright, and then sometimes it would go someplace and they'd find it someplace else. He said it looked like it was about 30 feet in diameter and looked like looking down on a parachute. And so he and his father went to the Coast Guard to get help to try to figure out what the thing was. And 2 Coast Guard officers came out, and the Coast Guard officers saw it too. And they had no idea what it was. And it would, sometimes it would turn its lights on, but if you bothered it, it would dim them or turn them off, and it would go someplace. And they thought it knew its way around the river because there was a trench down through the middle of the river, down deeper in the rest of the river. And it seemed to follow that trench. Well, this Coast Guard people were had no idea what it was either. And one of the Coast Guard men said that when they held an oar over it, that the light seemed to go right through it like a X-ray instead of making a shadow. And he thought this was pretty weird. And so anyway, it just showed up that one night, but the Navy took it very seriously and had some big officers come and interview them and talk to all of them and everything else. And one reason they took it seriously was because there was a nuclear submarine building area, which the government didn't want anybody to know about, but which was there, and or nuclear boat building area. I don't know, what kind of ships they were making. And because Kessler Air Force Base was there, and it's a big training area and very high tech. And the shipyard, which it was Huntington Ingalls Shipyard, and it was the biggest Navy shipyard that there, with different parts of it that there is. And so they were quite concerned about it. And actually, so this was taken seriously, but I said in my book, the abduction was closer to all those facilities and a little bit closer than the underwater submerged object, which the abduction was just, ridiculed, whereas the other one was taken seriously. And they were both, pretty close in time, a few weeks later. And so there was a totally different response from the government on the two.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's great that these witnesses are coming forward now and you're finding them, but did anyone actually speak up? I never actually chased this up, but shortly after the abduction itself, did you learn whether anyone had actually spoken up other than Charles or Calvin about what they saw and experienced?
Well, the sheriff said there were all these reports, and I don't know if anybody has the list of reports or anything, but he said there were 50 calls of people reporting something unusual.
Right.
And so that night there were a lot of other reports.
Yeah. Are you hopeful that more witnesses will still come forward?
Yeah. There's still a lot more. We have a lot less than 50 witnesses.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think what you've gathered so far is tremendous, but do you think there's still a smoking gun witness out there?
I hope so. It'd be nice.
Perhaps someone who, was abducted by the same aliens. I mean, that would really kind of put the cat amongst the pigeons. Yeah.
But having one is quite a bit. So.
Yeah. Well, Calvin, I mean, I interviewed Calvin a couple of years ago, and we had a good long chat about what happened. And one of the things in his life, and as he said, he's a very private person, but he decided to come out to support other abductees and encourage them to come forward as well. But he talked about having to move a lot because he wasn't really left alone, was he? I mean, every time a journalist would come calling, it would make him nervous.
Well, a lot of people would like to be famous. They'd like to be world famous, and he could just have that in a snap.
Yeah.
But he didn't want to, and he hid for a long time. There were other people that I interviewed that had seen something that same night in the same place. So I didn't answer your last question right. Yeah, I talked to some other people, but nobody else had that said they had been abducted. Yeah.
I mean, Calvin, has he ever confided in you about, the doubts that he had about whether people believed his story or not? Did that worry him whether they would believe him?
I didn't interview him. I interviewed his wife, and she said that afterwards that he had a nervous breakdown. He was just, and I talked to the doctor that saw him, and he said they were very, very shook up right afterwards. And the people, I talked to somebody in the police department who said that Calvin was just beside himself. And so he moved back with his parents for a while, and they were engaged, and they went on and got married. But she said that he never talked about it until when they started writing the books, which was recently.
Who encouraged Calvin to write that first book? I think it was 2017 or 18.
What she said happened is that they went to a funeral, And apparently he'd been kind of in hiding and disguised his name or things, but he signed his actual name. And he said she said people came up and started talking to him, and they were friendly. They weren't harassing him at all. They wanted to know what happened. They were sincere and they were concerned about him, that sort of thing. And so she said to him that it was time to say something about it. And then another person got him, Martin Willis, got him, interviewed him and things, and then got him hooked up with Philip Mantle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he trusted Philip Mantle, and his wife thought it was time for him to start talking about it.
Yeah.
So between all these people, he finally decided to say something, but he didn't want to up until then.
Yeah. I mean, the story itself, I mean, it's got a Hollywood blockbuster written all over it, but Calvin has been, and I'm sure they've come calling, but Calvin has been very reluctant going that way because he does not want anything changed in his story. He wants it told as it happened.
Well, that was one thing. He had a good publisher, Philip Mantle, because a lot of publishers want to change your English and, spruce things up and all that. Well, Calvin told him that he wanted to write it in his own words and he didn't want anybody changing anything. And so the publisher let him do it, even though the publisher was criticized a little bit for the English and things.
Right.
But he was nice enough to do that.
Okay, fantastic. Irina, you've certainly kept yourself busy since we last spoke, and there's been a lot happened too since we last spoke with UFOs becoming more prevalent on mainstream media. I mean, what have you got an opinion about what's going on at the moment?
No, I think what's interesting is that back in 1947, there was this Project Sign of the government for investigating UFOs, and they did a serious job. They considered it might be extraterrestrial, that these things are there, they're anomalous, they're not within our science and things. Then the government study turned into Project Grudge, and Grudge was the name because they were debunking. Then it turned into Project Blue Book, this big project.
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically debunking for the most part too. And then it stopped in 1969. And the government has been debunking ever since. And now finally they came out just a sliver, and they're just about back where they were in 1947. But they're not quite as scientific, I don't think, as they were back then.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, you've been in your lifetime, you've been there in the thick of things at Battelle, the Defense Intelligence Agency, at the Aerospace Center. Can you give us a clue into the psyche of the government or those people who seem determined to still keep this a mystery?
Well, when I worked at the DIA, I was in aircraft identification, air order of battle, the section was called, for a while. And it was where the government used their spy satellites and looked down and looked at other countries and identified all the military equipment, and mainly air order of battle was the airplanes. Mm-hmm. And so we were identifying airplanes. And I was about the only female there. And so that was weird enough. I didn't go around talking about UFOs much, but one day I mentioned UFOs. I think I said there was a newspaper article. And I expected to get harangued and everybody to, but my supervisors said that they had reported a UFO on our classified, it was real high security stuff too. Yeah. Our classified photography. And they said they reported it to their supervisors. And they said their supervisors said it wasn't there, that it was a spot on the film. Well, it wasn't a spot on the film because they showed me, I looked at it, it was on two different photographs. Yeah. Definitely wasn't a spot on the film, you can see detail. So anyway, their supervisor insisted it was a spot on the film, and they argued and had some professionals look at it who said it wasn't a spot on the film. And so they were pretty surprised at that. And one of my supervisors, I think, was a GS-14 or something. He should have been pretty high, but he must have not had a classification. But that made me think that the DIA probably knew a lot more about it than
Yeah.
they said. And now, you know, those videos that are being released and things are from the DIA.
Right, right, and
So I think,
that's what makes life interesting at the moment, on the UFO front. Irina, fantastic to catch up with you again, and I hope we can talk again next year when this new book is released and more witnesses come to bear. Calvin Parker, I mean, he's just a wonderful fellow. He's one of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet, and I hope he really gets some closure on this.
well, everybody trusts him. I'm very lucky because I'm working on something where everybody trusts a witness, and you know,
Yeah,
he's an honest person. No, people can tell that from knowing him.
yeah, yeah. Irina, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll talk again next year.
Okay, I hope so.